In an interview with author James Rosen, Justice Antonin Scalia's daughter Meg recalled, "After my dad's death, when people described him as larger than life, he was. And he was that way to us." When Rosen asked if Justice Scalia was cognizant of the grand impression he made, Meg would answer, "Oh, yes. I mean, he was putting on a show, but it was a great show." James Rosen on Justice Antonin Scalia's rise to greatness now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization and Culture podcast from Word on Fire. James Rosen, the chief White House correspondent for Newsmax, is a veteran Washington correspondent and best-selling historian. He reported for Fox News for nearly 2 decades, and his writings appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and National Review, among other outlets. Rosen's previous books include The Strong Man, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate, and Cheney One-on-One, a candid conversation with America's most controversial statesman. Rosen, his wife Sarah, and their 2 sons and 2 mischievous cats split their time between Washington, D.C. and Chesapeake Bay. James Rosen is the author of the new and acclaimed biography, Scalia, Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986. James, welcome. So glad to have you here.
Todd, you're very kind to have me. Thank you.
Segment 1, The Golden Boy. John Bolton, former Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legislative Affairs, told you, James, a story that when he called Antonin Scalia with news that the Senate had confirmed him to be on the Supreme Court with a vote of 98-0, Bolton was met with silence on the other end of the phone. James, what were the first words that came out of the newly minted Justice Scalia's mouth? Do you recall?
Yes, this comes from a story that John Bolton, who we're all familiar with as having been the National Security Advisor under President Trump and earlier the UN ambassador, back in 1986 when Antonin Scalia was confirmed by a vote of 98-0 by the U.S. Senate. It fell to Assistant Attorney General John Bolton at the time to track down the nominee, who was out at a black tie event, and communicate the news to him. And for this purpose, Bolton enlisted a dedicated line at the Willard Hotel kitchen, and also an employee from the Willard who would go corral Judge Scalia at the appointed hour and bring him to the telephone in the kitchen. This is exactly what played out. And as you say, when John Bolton, who knew Scalia quite well, they had been at AEI together, they knew each other. When Bolton said, "Nino, congratulations, you've been confirmed 98-0. And there was this silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Scalia's first words were, "Who were the 2 who didn't vote?" And Bolton says, "Oh, well, it was Barry Goldwater and Jake Garn." But isn't this fantastic? And Bolton again gets caught up in the revelry before he realizes the silence on the other end of the line. And finally, Scalia says, with a hint of rebuke in his voice, "You mean to tell me we couldn't get Goldwater and Garn?" And it's true. Ordinarily, those would have been 2 reliable votes for Scalia.
Sure.
As it happened, my research found that Goldwater went home sick as the vote was delayed into the evening. And Bolton related in this occasion to Scalia, "Well, Goldwater we just couldn't find. And Jake Garn is in the hospital donating his kidney to his daughter, Nino." Now, against the backdrop of the Scalia nominations, which was its pairing with another nomination, the elevation of William Rehnquist from Associate Justice to Chief Justice, which was very bitter and partisan and which ended with a high tally of 33 negative votes, even though Rehnquist was confirmed, they called it the Rehnquisition. At this point, Bolton told me in our interview that he had grown a little irritated by what Scalia was saying on the other end of the line. And he finally said to him, "Nino, concentrate, okay? Because from where Bolton sat against the Rehnquisition, 98-0 was looking pretty good." And he said, "You've just been confirmed 98-0. And finally, Scalia says, "You're right. That's great. You're right." But the imperfection of 98-0 continued to bother Scalia into the 21st century. Almost 20 years on the court, he can still be seen in C-SPAN videos telling school children, "Let's make it 100.
James, on that note, I mean, you open the book, which is a riveting book. You open the book with this story, and I just want to ask you. You obviously chose that as a kind of to make a point. When you heard that story from John Bolton's mouth, what impression did that make on you about the nature of Scalia, the man?
I'm so glad you asked this because to those who would examine the appendix at the back of the book, which is the list of interviewees, very closely, they might note that John Bolton was the very first interview I conducted for this book. And I happened just to mention to him casually that I had begun writing this book. And he said, "Oh, I've got a great Scalia story. No one's ever told it." And so we recorded the interview, and I knew instantly in that very first interview, at the very dawn of this project, that that was going to be the opening scene in the book. And nothing that in all the research I did over the next 5 years, tons and tons of documents and interviews and tapes and so on, nothing that I found disturbed that. I wanted that to be the opening for the book from the very outset, and it was. And the reason for it, to get to your question, is because I take from it what John Bolton took from it. In fact, if you look at the transcript that's in the book, the very first words out of me after hearing the story are, "What do you take away from that?" Which I always find to be a very useful question for a reporter or a historian to ask, because it elicits from the participants in the event their true feelings and observations about it. And Bolton said that Nino never missed a trick, that he wanted 100 to nothing.
Mm,
As I say in the book, this commitment, not just to excellence, but to perfection,
right.
was the hallmark of Antonin Scalia's life in all of its different phases and aspects. And I closed the opening sequence with a quote from Justice Scalia, who said, "When the Heavenly Father said to us to be ye perfect, I believe he meant for us to be perfect in all things, and including most especially that most important of things, your life's work."
Yeah, that's something else. I imagine it would be he'd have some tough counsel for modern Supreme Court nominees who are just barely skating through, with a bare majority and so on. So it's extraordinarily telling tale to open this book with. So I really appreciated this.
Mhm. Thank you.
James, in his poem "My Heart Leaps Up," William Wordsworth observed that the child is the father of the man. Now, Antonin Scalia, affectionately nicknamed Nino, was the only child of an Italian immigrant college professor of Romance languages and an Irish American primary school teacher. He was the solitary nephew doted upon by both sides of his extended family. Tell us a little bit about the young Antonin Scalia.
Todd, I'm so grateful for your very in-depth questions, and it shows that you took the time to read the book, which I appreciate. They teach us in TV school, in my day job, as you know, that you're never supposed to correct the host unless there's some absolute imperative reason to do so. And I confess that I feel compelled to do so here,
Correct me.
which is that Antonin Scalia was, at the time, of course, of his confirmation to the Supreme Court, he was widely hailed, and justly so, as the embodiment of the American dream. Back when the American dream was understood in many cases to encompass the immigrant experience.
Mm,
Scalia's father came to this country from Italy in 1920 with just $400 in his pocket, not speaking a word of English,
mm.
and made of himself, as you say, a renowned professor in Romance languages. Scalia's mother was the daughter of
Oh, that's right. Italian, not Irish.
Italian. Yes, I think you might have had in mind Maureen Scalia, the
Oh,
just
that's right. That's
wife
right.
of
Forgive me.
55 years, who
Yep,
came from an Irish background.
that's right.
Um, but in any case, the Scalia parents, getting to the part of your question about the child being father to the man and so forth, were deeply devout Catholics.
Mm,
And from those three influences, from his mother, who venerated form and made sure that young Nino Scalia associated with the right people and took an active interest in his extracurricular pursuits and so on, from his father, whose own published academic works warned of the potential for sacred texts to be distorted in their meaning by a dishonest translator or interpreter, and from the sacred foundational texts of the Catholic Church itself and its liturgy and so on. Young Antonin Scalia emerged with a profound reverence
mm.
for the original meaning of texts. The text was not something in the Scalia household that was to be monkeyed with. And of course, Scalia carried this forward for the rest of his life, um, beyond school, of course, as a federal judge and then as a justice on the Supreme Court. His education included two Jesuit schools, in both of which he was valedictorian. From 1953 to, or excuse me, 1949 to 53, Scalia attended Xavier High School in Manhattan. He commuted on the subway from Queens. And this was a unique school, a hybrid, if you will, of a Jesuit private school and a military academy.
Mm.
Scalia graduated as valedictorian. The photograph in the middle of Scalia Rise to Greatness shows him uh, on his graduation day as a cadet with a chest full of ribbons for extracurricular pursuits and all of his academic successes. and his hair is parted perfectly, jet black, winning smile, trim and handsome cadet. A lot of people might find it difficult to recognize the older Antonin Scalia in this photo. But then he went to Georgetown University, which was also a Jesuit institution. And of course, it bears noting, as Father Paul Scalia, the justice's son, who was interviewed for this project, told me, that the Jesuits were known for something very different back in Scalia's day than they
Sure.
are today. But to this point of sacred texts and how it stayed with him, even in these Jesuitical settings, Scalia told for the rest of his life a story that happened that he observed in high school at Xavier. There was a fearsome Irish Jesuit priest named Father Tom Matthews, who spoke with a thick Boston Irish brogue and who terrified the students in general. There was a point where they were reading Hamlet, and a wise guy in the class, not Scalia, piped up with some sophomore comment about the play or about Shakespeare. And Scalia never forgot what happened next. He called it the Shakespeare principle, and as I say, he recounted it for the rest of his life. Father Tom Matthews glared down at the offending wise guy and said to him, "Mister, when you're reading Shakespeare, Shakespeare's not on trial, you are." And again, here we have the notion that Shakespeare is inviolable.
Yeah.
The question is whether you are up to Shakespeare,
Yeah.
not whether you can graft what you think is amusing or interesting or urgent onto Shakespeare. And again, this was carried forward for the rest of Scalia's career.
You know, that I love that story. I loved reading it. I remember it actually. I thought it was in an interview with Leslie Stahl, if I'm not mistaken, that he had related. At least that was where I think I might have encountered it. I have to confess that it was that story, in fact, that made me reapproach Dostoevsky, made me reapproach Shakespeare, because I thought, you know what, even Chesterton. Just because I did not find myself completely grappling with what these people were writing, doesn't mean that they were deficient. It may have meant, in fact, that I was deficient. And I think that's to Scalia's point, having reapproached this, and I say this to the medical students and the residents I work with about reading great literature. Just because it's hard when you're a ninth grader doesn't mean it's not worth it. And secondly, doesn't mean it won't speak to you differently when you reapproach it later, when you're better read. So it's an extraordinary work. The other extraordinary quote, the one thing I want to say, James, too, that I really like that you're mentioning here, is the reverence for the text in his faith. And also, if I'm not mistaken, his father's work with languages and translation and so on, and the need to be meticulous in translation of language, and how he had not even truly encountered the law in so far as he knew it as a judge and a justice, for him to value the notion that words matter, that interpretation of words matter, and we shouldn't get sloppy or manipulative with it,
Yeah.
lest the consequences fall upon our heads.
Yes, and Father Paul Scalia said in his own masterpiece of a homily that he delivered for his father after his passing in February 2016, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
Yeah.
That's the wellspring. I like to say that Catholicism was the rocket fuel for Antonin Scalia's rise to greatness. And I'm proud to say that a number of reviewers from faith-based outlets have recognized in Scalia rise to greatness what they say is a rare moment where a major biography of a public official or a public figure in American life treats his faith seriously.
Yeah.
And I was struck that anyone should even regard such a thing as remarkable, but maybe it is. The other area that I emphasize, besides Scalia's own genius, his capacity for hard work, and his affability, the various gifts he possessed, the contributions and sacrifices of Maureen Scalia on Antonin Scalia's rise to greatness, which are Herculean and really examined here in their sort of quotidian detail of raising, let's say, 8 kids of the 9 were born ranging in age from a year to 15 years of age. And your husband, Assistant Attorney General Antonin Scalia, in the Ford administration, is off to an ABA conference in Germany for 6 days. These were the hardest days for Maureen Scalia. And so what I found, too, I should point out, Todd, is that the previous 2 biographies of Antonin Scalia that were out there, both were published when he was alive. One of them he cooperated with extensively, the other not at all. And both came out pretty much in the same way, which is to say, openly hostile to Justice Scalia's conduct, his legacy, his jurisprudence. So I like to say that Scalia Rise to Greatness is the first comprehensive biography of him, treating such matters as his Catholicism and Maureen's contributions with a much greater scope and depth than ever before. based on documentary and personal sources that were either unavailable to or overlooked by the previous hostile biographers. I like to say, therefore, that this is the first accurate biography of
Yeah.
Antonin Scalia because it's the first admiring one.
I've read the other two that you're mentioning, plus a number of works of on Scalia or his jurisprudence, and I will say it was really enjoyable to read a work of a person I admire and see how much more I can come to admire him through the course of his life. So, and I appreciate I appreciate that you treated him honestly. It isn't just, this is not a hagiography. This is a recognition of the virtues that he brought to his family, to his faith, and also to his work as a justice. I want to talk about something. We're going to come back to Maureen and also his faith. But before we move to the next segment, I want to ask you one more question about Sam. I think it's Salvatore
Mhm.
Scalia,
Yes.
Antonin's father. So he seemed to live large in the consciousness of the young Scalia, and as obviously Scalia got older. Um, in spite of his 6 years of Latin and 5 years of Greek, you know that Scalia called it the shame of his life that he never learned the Italian his father wished. So later in life, you had mentioned that Scalia would even send his federal opinions to his father, who would then mark them up with an editor's pen and send them back. In what ways, James, we think about all the stories of fathers and sons, the Shakespearean dramas out there. In what ways did Sam Scalia form his son?
So we are obliged, I suppose, looking back on it in purely biographic or historical terms, to say that Sam Scalia shaped his son in conjunction with Mrs. Scalia,
Yeah,
Catherine Pinero Scalia, who also shaped their son at the same time. We can't just, I think, view the contributions of one in isolation
sure.
from the other. But that methodological throat clearing having been accomplished, Todd, I would say that uh, Scalia's father was hard on him and a difficult man to please. And this comes through in all the interviews I did with 4 of the 9 Scalia children for this project. Not a majority in Supreme Court terms, I know, but still a healthy sampling. And they all talked about how even when he was a federal judge and Antonin Scalia would come home from a day's work on the federal bench, one of the most important judges in the country at that point, and stand at his own kitchen table in his own house and open up the comics and read Peanuts and other
Yeah.
strips with a whiskey sour just to relax and unwind a little bit. His father, sitting there in old age, would say, "What kind of man reads the funny papers?" with a bitter remark. I mean, the old man would even mark up the grandchildren's letters.
Mm.
Scalia's children's letters to him would come back with the red pen
Oh,
marks.
wow.
Um, Scalia tells the story when he was a federal judge of how he would send the opinions, and you mentioned they would get marked up. The specific complaint of the Romance languages professor was that where at the end, as a matter of boilerplate, where Scalia's opinions would say "ordered affirmed," Salvatore Scalia would send them back to his son with that circled in red and say "ordered that it be affirmed." And so Scalia's opinions were the first
Oh,
in the
man.
federal bench to use that formulation.
So it stuck. It actually stuck.
But as to how that impacted Scalia, obviously his father set a standard for seriousness of purpose and intellectual rigor. Father Paul recounted for me how, as a young child, he understood that his own father, Justice Scalia, had an office at home. That door would be closed, and that one knocked on that door and interrupted this place of isolation and labor only with the greatest discernment of when
Mhm.
it was truly necessary. And from his father, he himself became, as he liked to call himself, a snoot, which is a word that means somebody who is very fastidious about the English language and obscure words and usage regulations and so on, and who picks apart had his own penchant for picking people apart on picayune grammatical bases
Sure.
or word choice bases. So it's not to say that the sternness of his father was unrelievedly a negative imprint on young Antonin Scalia. I think he learned much from him. When he told an interviewer on television that it was only after his mother died that he began to realize how much of a profound impact that she had had on him in terms of hosting his Cub Scout meetings in their home, making sure he was associating with the right kids,
Mm-hmm.
uh, keeping after him on homework, piano lessons, and so on. So I think she was the gentler soul for sure. And it may be that Scalia's sense of whimsy and the humor that marked all of his oral arguments and opinions and public appearances may more derive from the influence of his mother.
Segment 2, Working Stiff. In searching for a lawyer to serve as Assistant Attorney General in the White House Office of Legal Counsel, a role also known as the President's lawyer's lawyer, Lawrence Silverman insisted it was absolutely imperative to have a first-class legal mind and a man of courage. Spanning over 20 years, Scalia served in various roles as lawyer for the international law firms Jones Day, professor of administrative law at the University of Virginia, general counsel for Nixon's Office of Telecommunications Policy, chair of the United States Administrative Conference, assistant attorney general for the Office of Legal Counsel, and professor at University of Chicago Law School. Now, Scalia dealt with everything from the future internet to the legal ownership of President Nixon's infamous White House tapes, from the Freedom of Information Act to congressional limits on executive authority. James, could you offer an example or two of formative moments? I know there's legion, but tell me an example or two of formative moments that came from these diverse and demanding roles.
I'm very proud that Scalia Rise to Greatness is the first book to publish from so many different sets of archival documents that were either overlooked by or unavailable to the previous biographers. One example would be the secret oral history that Antonin Scalia conducted in his Supreme Court chambers in 1992. He had a female attorney he had known for many years come in and serve as the oral history interviewer in a look back on his own life, which ran for several dozen pages and was unsealed for the first time in 2018. And so I make use of that for the first time here.
Wow.
Another is his FBI files, declassified after his death, which ran into the hundreds of pages because as he rose through the judicial and executive branches, Scalia was subjected to 4 different FBI background checks within 14 years, 1972 to 86. And you can actually see this process become more and more computerized over time as the agents start making reference to data banks and so forth. These go for hundreds and hundreds of pages, and the FBI agents who were fanned out across the country in an effort to try to ascertain whether there existed any kind of morsel of derogatory information about Antonin Scalia anywhere in the world of any kind. The dragnet turned up completely empty each time for the simple reason that none existed, because Scalia and Maureen lived exemplary Catholic lives. But page after page after page, the agents who were sent out to interview people who knew Scalia dating back to 1949 when he was 13 heard the same things over and over and over again. This is the most honest man I've ever met. This is the most intellectually brilliant man I've ever met. This man is not just qualified to be a federal judge. You could not invent a more qualified person to serve as a federal judge. Would that all lives paid such close scrutiny would reward with such superlative testimonials. And another set of documents I call the RBG Nino Papers. These hail from Scalia's tenure on the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. That's the federal appellate court that is one rung below the Supreme Court, often itself described as the second most powerful court in America. Scalia was on that court from 82 to 86 before President Reagan elevated him to the Supreme Court. And in those 4 years, 82 to 86, it was a real murderer's row of judicial legal talent that served as judges on that court. Robert Bork, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Scalia, Kenneth Starr, Larry Silberman, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg's papers, 220 boxes at the Library of Congress, contain and have open to researchers her papers from her tenure on the D.C. Circuit. And Scalia's papers for the equivalent period are not open, but the judges on these panels and the justices on the Supreme Court, all they really do is circulate back and forth draft opinions, memoranda, letters, little arguments about what might be changed, and so on. So their papers tend to commingle, if you will. And from RBG's papers at the Library of Congress for her tenure on the D.C. Circuit, I was able to collect hundreds of handwritten letters, memos, correspondence, draft opinions that flew back and forth between the chambers of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia when they were federal appellate judges together. And not only, I call these the RBG Nino Papers, they've never been published before, and not only do they capture 2 legal geniuses squaring off over the First Amendment and other issues that arose before them as jurists, but their sparkling wits, their affection for each other, and really the birth and blossoming of this famous friendship, which, as you know, Todd, is celebrated in stage plays and operas.
Yeah.
I even saw a life coach urging us all earlier this year to go out and find the Ginsburg for our inner Scalia. But here is really, in their own words, in real time, how this friendship took off. And then lastly, to your question about critical moments in his career, additional sets of documents, again, never before published, include his papers from when he was general counsel to the White House Office of Telecommunications Policy, or OTP. The Office of Telecommunications Policy was created by the Nixon administration in 1970, and Scalia was its first general counsel. Excuse me. No researcher previously had gone through all of Scalia's papers from his period as the general counsel to the Office of Telecommunications Policy. And he and the new director, who was even younger than Scalia, they were both in their early 30s, a guy named Tom Whitehead of Kansas, who was an absolute genius with multiple advanced degrees from places like MIT and worked at the Rand Corporation. This was an honest-to-God visionary, and someone should do a full biography of Tom Whitehead at some point. But he hired Scalia. He gave Scalia his first job in government. And the two of them pursued something and finally were able to ram down the throats of the entrenched bureaucracy around them, who wondered why there needed to be a White House Office of Telecommunications Policy when they, meaning the FCC or the State Department or so on, all had their hooks into telecommunications policy at the time. Whitehead, who dreamt up this agency, knew that the sprawling behemoth of the federal government needed to consolidate telecom policy under the administrative control of the White House, because telecom was the future. And he enlisted Scalia in what they called the open skies policy. This was, and again, they were able to implement this against great resistance inside the government. This was the idea that free market principles should be applied to what was then a monopolistic enterprise, the launching of space satellites, domestic space satellites, into space, which was only performed at that time by a quasi-public entity called ComSat. And so Whitehead and Scalia wanted any qualified firm that possessed the requisite technical prowess and capital reserves to be allowed to launch a domestic space satellite into space. And that's what happened under the open skies policy. And it turbocharged the telecom revolution as we know it today. Scalia and his colleagues, if you look at their routing slips and their memos and their drafts, they were throwing around terms back then in the early 1970s that wouldn't escape the lips of most Americans for another 25 years, like shared networks and communication systems. Scalia wrote a paper in 1971 in which he described the coming of what he called, with capital letters, the computer society. And in this paper, Scalia predicted that in the future, users of computers at remote terminals would not only have, as he put it, access to hundreds of channels of television, but would also do their banking from these terminals and would even be able to retrieve information from just about any library in the world. Scalia predicted the massive financial injection that telecom would bring, which, as he showed in one of his papers, dwarfed all other sectors of the American economy. And he also predicted the privacy concerns that would arise with this technology. As his colleagues who I interviewed for the project said to me, Nino got technology. We can go on about the new documents from the Ford period, but perhaps it's best to cede here. I just wanted to give you a sense for some of the critical moments that are unearthed for the first time in Scalia Rise to Greatness.
You know, it's amazing because when I first encountered his work in the Office of Telecommunications, I thought, what a strange place for such a bright guy to land. And it struck me as this kind of arcane kind of corner of the government that I'm. But then when you've unpacked it with the role with respect to, again, cell phones, satellites, the internet, and so on, it's amazing how much he had his fingers in and his vision on the future as we are now experiencing it, and so and how much an active role he had in helping that to unfold. It's extraordinary story. A law partner said, Nino loved intellectual combat. He just thrived on it. Another described Scalia as one of the last great generalists. He did damn near everything, and he did it well. A White House colleague confirmed that Scalia called things straight and that he was totally objective in his formulation of opinions and interpretation of the laws. He allowed no politics to become involved in decisions on matters of law. And finally, at the Office of Legal Counsel, it was said that when told that Scalia weighed in on their concern, the listener immediately felt a rush of comfort, swathed in certitude that the matter had been studied by the best of the best. So, James, this is a larger question. It's a little bit kind of, it's a little bit amorphous, but his FBI files, which were people can say bad things anonymously about somebody to the FBI if they want to, if they have an axe to grind. It was stunning how many positive things over and over and over were anonymously being said, and that was you're breaking that. You're revealing that to us for the first time. It's quite a testimony to the way the person's living outside of the bright, the shiny lights of the media and so on. When you hear all these positive things said about Scalia, what made him so good? I mean, I know it's a hard question to answer, but when you think about your analysis of him, what makes a guy like Scalia become as good as he was in terms of his capabilities to achieve what he achieved?
We've said it before in this broadcast. There was A, his Catholic faith, which is the rocket fuel. There is B, his parents, with their own perspectives, each of them influencing him toward a standard, again, not just of excellence, but of perfection. There was his own innate gifts, his genius, his capacity for hard work, his affability, his wit. And then lastly, there is Maureen Scalia, whose contributions, whose sacrifices enabled Scalia to put all of those things in play. But where the specific attribute of goodness, of moral virtue is concerned, Scalia later said that he felt that had been, for all of his academic excellence and extracurricular vigor, that it had been the determination of his Jesuit teachers and drill instructors at Xavier to form moral character in the cadets that was most important. I think in his own ability to live an exemplary and lead an exemplary life.
It's extraordinary because what you're pointing to is, again, faith, family, discipline. The gifts it's great that the gifts are there, but if they're not sustained by a robust faith, by a supportive family, and by a self-discipline that was learned by being mentored in the discipline of being formed into a good moral character, a lot of gifts can go to waste. So that's extraordinary. Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization and Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization and Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, Nino. In a speech at the Knights of Columbus, Scalia said, If I have brought any message today, it is this: have the courage to have your wisdom regarded as stupidity, be fools for Christ, and have the courage to suffer the contempt of the sophisticated world. So let's consider the personal side of Antonin Scalia. We've alluded to it as we've talked so far today: faith, family, and the famous Scalia wit. Anything else you want to say about the role Catholicism played in Antonin Scalia's life, not just in his early formative years, but to the very end of his days?
Well, Scalia, first of all, was a devout Catholic and a champion of the High Latin Mass. He was a critic of Vatican II. In this, he had much in common with the subject of my last book before this one, William F. Buckley, who again was another New Yorker and a devout Catholic who favored High Latin Mass and was a critic of Vatican II. Scalia took pains when he became a justice on the Supreme Court to make it understood that he never saw it as appropriate to graft his Catholicism onto his judicial decision-making. We will talk, I hope, about the very legacy in his chosen profession that makes Scalia not just one of the most important Supreme Court justices in recent times, but one of the most important Americans of the last 100 years. His championing of originalism and textualism and how that changed law in this country. But he didn't, precisely because he was an originalist, who favored that judges and justices, when they're engaged in their central business, which is interpreting the meaning of the Constitution or a given statute, should adhere to the original meaning that that document had when it was enacted, the meaning it was widely understood to have when it was enacted, and not go grafting latter day policy preferences or sensibilities and trying to expand the meaning of these provisions, like the way the so-called living Constitution would work. Scalia stood athwart all of that. Um, and precisely for that reason, he would never have seen it as appropriate to write his Catholic views into his decisions, because the original meaning of the given constitutional provision or statute wasn't necessarily oriented toward a Catholic point of view or liturgy. And in fact, one of his dear friends published an op-ed in the early 21st century asserting that Scalia had begun doing just that. It caused a rift between them that lasted for about 5 years before they reconciled. What's the way Scalia would put it with his usual wit was that there is no such thing as a Catholic hamburger. He would say the closest we could come to a Catholic hamburger would be a hamburger that is made perfectly.
Also on this note, there's a quote of his that says, "I don't think there's any such thing as a Catholic judge. There are good judges and bad judges. The only article in faith that plays any part in my judging is the commandment, thou shalt not lie." And I think there was always that kind of murmuring among people who were opposed to Justice Scalia, the notion that, well, his Catholicism is going to taint his jurisprudence and so on. And what he has said time and time again is that it is not the case.
Well,
I'm a judge.
if I'm sorry to interrupt, but in
Please.
historical terms, there oughtn't to be much that when we look back on this line of criticism against Justice Scalia that should separate us from the year 1960 and the insinuations that John F. Kennedy, if elected president, would serve as a vassal of the Pope in Rome simply because
Yeah.
he was a Catholic.
Right.
It's caricaturational, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. We've mentioned, I'm going to move to Maureen. We've mentioned Maureen a number of times. So when Antonin Scalia married Maureen, it seems like in interviews with the kids, the Scalia children, and others who knew Maureen and so on, it seems like even Antonin Scalia would admit he kind of married up, that she was an extraordinary woman. And though loving his family, his wife and 9 children, and having a presence at home, I think Scalia's daughter said to you, as Dad used to say, he did the Constitution and she did everything else. What I want to ask you is, when I was reading this story, or this biography, this first volume, Maureen Scalia struck me a little bit like Clementine Churchill. That Winston would not have been Winston without Clementine. And I'm curious, is that an appropriate parallel, or how would you further unpack who Maureen was in the life of Antonin Scalia?
Yes, well, I'm very pleased that in some of the early reviews for Scalia Rise to Greatness, some have actually, more than one has stated that where Antonin Scalia is the star of this book, it is Maureen Scalia who emerges as the hero.
Yeah.
And I'm pleased for that because, again, unlike in the previous hostile biographies, where only very short shrift was given to Catholicism and to Maureen and certain other important elements of Scalia's rise, this book treats these subjects in the depth they warrant. So where many people like to make mention of the 9 children, no one ever in print that I've ever saw did as I do here and examined the actual spans of time between the births, and saw where along the way was the sort of peak activity in the production of children and where it started to taper off and so on. And I told the story earlier in our broadcast about how in 1976, Scalia, when he served as Assistant Attorney General, had to submit all of his requests for foreign travel to the National Security Council at the White House. And so at the Ford Library, there is a rich record of NSC officials invariably granting approval for Scalia to travel overseas to Europe. And there would be, just in the 1 year of 1976, a 6-day trip to Germany, a 3-day trip to Italy, a trip to London, and we would see that he would be gone for sometimes stretches of 9 days.
Yeah,
And this is a point where the Scalias had 8 of their 9 children, ranging in age from 1-year-old to 15 years of age. There's a story that Scalia's daughter Meg told me, which I found heartbreaking, and is included in this book, where particularly when they moved to Chicago after the Ford administration ended, and Scalia taught at the University of Chicago Law School for 5 years until he was appointed to the federal bench, where they had 1 year off where he taught at Stanford in California. The years in Chicago were harder on the family and on Maureen for sure. And again, this is where the nine of them had, I should say, the 11 of them had moved. On August 16, 1977 was when they made the drive out to Chicago. That was the day Elvis Presley died. But
Mm.
Meg Scalia told me that during the Chicago years, Maureen was so desperate to meet new people that she would, with a bassinet or stroller, she would observe another mom who had a stroller. And she would try to memorize the day and the time of day, the day of the week and the time of the day, so that she might be able to approach this person, and find that when they might actually next be there, just to make a friend. And it
Wow.
speaks to the loneliness of the stay-at-home mom. And here again,
Yes.
you had kids ranging in age from 1 year to 15 years. So I say in the book that Maureen Scalia, living, loving, tireless saint and mom, for
Yeah.
such an individual as extraordinary as that, and who was described as even more brilliant than her husband by their daughter, these were the hardest days.
Yeah. Yeah, what a testimony, and again, a real praise to the mothers out there who oftentimes are not celebrated next to their esteemed husbands. It's an extraordinary story. Um, so let's talk a little bit about Scalia's wit. In later years in the court, he called a particular opinion pure applesauce. He criticized his colleagues' reasoning as interpretive jiggery pokery. Um, what is about Scalia that he has such his dissents, his majority opinions, his speeches, they are captivating, and not in no small part because there's so much wit weaved in and out of them. What can you say about your understanding of his wit in all of your studies?
Well, certainly Scalia's wit was a function both of an inclination toward humorousness, but
Hmm.
also his love and delight in the English language. And so, for example, as a justice on the Supreme Court, one of his opinions in which he sought to demonstrate the impropriety of extracting too much authority from a particularly narrow section of a given statute, he would say that Congress was not in the habit of hiding elephants in mouse holes. And he had a way of putting things that even lay audiences could understand. And I should point out
Yeah.
that that was very much an aim of this book, to write Scalia Rise to Greatness in a way where you didn't have to be a lawyer to enjoy it. And I predict that the people who read this book, probably yourself, um, uh, will find themselves cracking up at different points because of Scalia's marvelous wit.
My daughter, I always ask my daughters before I do a podcast if they have any particular questions. My daughter is quite familiar with Justice Scalia, but she's currently studying the judiciary in her eighth grade civics class. She wanted to ask you, of all of Scalia's memorable lines, and there are so many, do you have a personal favorite?
Well, there are so many of them. It's hard to keep
Yeah.
track and to produce them on the spur of the moment, because after all, he was trafficking in the written word. But of course, where the spoken word is concerned, there was his devastating moment during the arguments for Bush v. Gore, when one of the lawyers who was only making his first ever appearance before the Supreme Court kept misidentifying the various justices, provoking irritation from David Souter at one point. And when it next became Scalia's turn to talk, he interjected politely and said, "I'm Scalia." And if you check out the audio recording that the Supreme Court itself made and posted online from that oral argument, the laughter that erupts in response to Scalia saying, "I'm Scalia," is is more redolent of a comedy club than it is like a Supreme Court. It's just outrageous comedy laughter at that moment. And in one of the earlier biographies, this was cited as an example of Scalia's cruelty, that he was sort of clipping the wings off of an injured fly.
Uh,
And I contacted the lawyer and I called him up. And of course, this would be in volume two. It's not in volume one here. But he told me to the contrary. He was grateful for what Scalia did. He understood what Scalia was doing, which was to interrupt his downward spiral. And he told me that this lawyer, Joseph Clock, that had Scalia not done so, he was confident he was going to completely spiral out of control. The point where
hmm.
he wrote to Scalia to thank him, and I asked if he would share that correspondence with me, and he did, in which Scalia also wrote back to him on Supreme Court stationery. In the book, we will make the point only in the footnotes that Joseph Clock's letter to Scalia thanking him was dated in January uh, 2001. So he got the date wrong on 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 Scalia, on his letter to Scalia, but Scalia did not mention it in the reply.
Segment 4, Justice Scalia. In 1959, as a 22-year-old living in Queens, New York, Antonin Scalia prophesied to a friend and future priest of Opus Dei, quote, "I'm going to the Supreme Court. I will be sent to Washington, and then I will rise," end quote. James, just out of curiosity, what was your reaction when Father Connor told you this?
So this was in a lengthy interview that I conducted by telephone with Father Robert Connor in December 2020. Connor was one of only 3 people I could find who was a surviving classmate of Antonin Scalia's graduating class at Xavier High School in 1953. One of the other 2 was also interviewed for the book and was a very important source. The third, by the way, whom I also contacted, was President Trump's Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, but who told me he did not know Scalia at Xavier. Father Connor knew Scalia quite well when he was just Bob Connor. The 2 of them in high school played in the marching band together. They shot hoops together. Scalia fixed Bob Connor up with a date at one point. They attended dances with girls together. They knew each other very well. And Scalia was so accomplished at Xavier that he was already beginning to appear on television, on the burgeoning medium of television, in student debate programs, and also on radio, quiz shows, and so on. Once he was put up at the Algonquin and given $50 cash. And Bob Connor's own father used to tell him, "Oh, you missed it. You should have seen Scalia on the tube today. He really gave it to him." And so here was Antonin Scalia as a teenager who had fans out there. Um,
Amazing.
the 2 of them were less in touch as they went to college and then on to professional school, or graduate school, I should say. And in the summer of 1959, um, by that point, Scalia is 22 years old. He's completed his second year at Harvard Law, and Bob Connor was in med school. Now, I should point out that the first question I asked Father Connor when I interviewed him was whether he had ever been interviewed before about his friendship with Antonin Scalia. He said no. I said, "What about by the FBI?" He said, "No, I think I'd remember that." We should point out further that Father Connor, although he was in his mid-80s and remains with us and still emails me periodically, chiefly to thank me for the account in the book. He is still active as a priest. He still preaches Opus Dei. He blogs about Opus Dei. And he was very sharp of memory and locution. In remembering this, I consider him an unimpeachable witness and decisive on the point, which was one of the few remaining mysteries of Antonin Scalia's life, which was when first began to burn within him this ambition to serve on the Supreme Court. And so this story had never been told before. And Connor recounted that his mother was distraught because that summer of 1959, Bob Connor decided he was going to drop out of med school and go study Opus Dei in Rome. Mrs. Connor thought her son was throwing away his future, and in desperation summoned to the house 2 men whom she thought might be able to talk sense into her son. One was a Jesuit priest who came and spoke and left, and the other was Nino Scalia. And as Connor recalled it to me, he was sitting in the upstairs bedroom of his brother at the Connor family home on the south side of Downey Road in Jamaica, Queens, when he was startled to see walk into that room his buddy Nino Scalia. And Scalia turned his palms upward and said, "What are you doing?" And Father Connor recounted to me that he, at the time, Bob Connor, said to Scalia, "I'm going to go study Opus Dei in Rome." And I said, "Did Scalia, devout as he was already, have any idea, it seemed to you, as to what Opus Dei is?" And Father Bob said that he explained it to him, that we in Opus Dei find the sanctity in everyday things, everyday life. And Scalia sort of shrugged and said, "Sounds good to me." And again, this story had never been told before. Connor then says to young Nino Scalia, "What are you doing?" And Scalia says, "I'm going to the Supreme Court." And Bob Connor says, "How are you going to do that?" And as Father Connor recounted it to me, he said, "James, he had a law firm job lined up with a firm in Ohio somewhere." And I said, "Yes, Cleveland Jones Day, where he practiced for the first 6 years out of law school." He said, "Yes, it was Jones Day." He said, "They have a Washington office. I will be sent to Washington, and I will rise." And I said, "Did it strike you as comical or fanciful that he said such a thing?" He said, "No, no, no, no." He said, "Nino was driven." I said, "Did you get the idea that he regarded this as a divine calling?" And Father Connor said, "I bet." And the way he described it to me was it was a convergence of two transcendent moments, two
Mm.
friends, where one says, "Where are you going?" And I say, "I'm going to God." And I say, "Where are you going?" And he says, "I'm going to the Supreme Court." The two fell out of touch, not through acrimony, but just kind of drift. And over the ensuing 2 decades, Father Connor, who was ordained in 1964, kept wondering, where is Scalia? When will he rise? Where is the rising? And
Mm.
finally, he saw the news in 1982 that President Reagan had nominated Scalia to the federal bench, the Court of Appeals.
Mhm.
And he wrote the letter that rekindled their friendship and which remained for the rest of Scalia's life, another 33 years, where Father Bob had dinner over at the Scalias maybe half a dozen times a year. They would do something they used to do back in Xavier, which is conjugate Latin verbs in 60 seconds
That's
under the
right.
threat of a stopwatch. And Father Bob Connor told me that he would occasionally tease his friend, the Supreme Court Justice, with this story of how I will rise. And Scalia would harumph, "Oh, I couldn't have said any such thing." But as Father Bob said to me, he said it.
It's funny. When I came across that in your book about the 60-second conjugation, I told that to my two daughters. I have my 10th grade daughter is in her fourth year of Latin, and she was saying that's tough.
Yeah.
That's tough. So I figured we might
Terrifying.
have to do a pre-dinner ritual where I'm doing having them do a 60-second conjugation before they get to eat. Well, you brought up the notion of him being nominated in 1982 and confirmed to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and in his tenure on the appeals court. This is striking. He wrote 86 majority opinions, of which 90% were unanimous. And of the 7 cases that were reviewed on appeal by the Supreme Court, 6 were upheld. Give us your thoughts on what made Judge Scalia's, not yet Justice, Judge Scalia's opinion so successful.
Again, it has to do with the force of his intellect and the power of the idea that he was advancing. And maybe this is a good time to talk about that idea. Again,
Yep.
Antonin Scalia is one of the most important Americans of the last 100 years in any discipline, whether you want to consider him up there with Babe Ruth or President Kennedy or anybody else. And the reason why is because Scalia's revolution in the law touches every American life today, simply because the courts reach out into every area and regulate every area of American life today. When Scalia came along on the federal bench, there prevailed in the law a liberal notion called the living Constitution. This was the idea that the Constitution should be considered a living, expanding document whose meaning can be expanded to accommodate for modern phenomena that the founding fathers never could have envisioned, such as nuclear weapons or the internet. And in order to breathe this expanded life and meaning into these legal documents, such as the Constitution or a given statute, liberal judges would bypass the text and
Mhm.
instead cite the legislative intent behind the law. What was said in all of those House and Senate floor debates, what was printed in all of those committee reports that were generated along the way as a given measure
Mhm.
snaked its way through the process. Scalia stood athwart all of that. Scalia's idea was originalism, that judges and justices, when they're engaged in their central business of interpreting what the Constitution or a given statute means, should be guided not by legislative intent, however you wanted to define that. Scalia said nobody voted on a House or Senate floor debate. Nobody voted on a
Right.
committee report. They voted on the text of a given law. And that's what was signed by a president into law, was a given text. And the meaning doesn't change over time or get loaded up with like a Christmas tree with whatever you want to put into it. It has the meaning that it had and was widely understood to have when it was enacted. To do anything other would be, in essence, these are my words, not Justice Scalia's, to travel back in time and rob an entire generation of their democratic self governance. Imagine if you were a fan of a law that President Biden signed last year, conferring legal recognition on same sex marriages. How would you like it if 10 or 20 or 50 or 200 years from now, some unelected judge or justice comes along and says, well, actually, that law means this now, because I think it should have an expanded meaning to account for new phenomena. If you want to account for new phenomena, Scalia said, you have a legislature that can pass new laws. And how would we divine the original meaning of a constitutional provision or a statute? And for this, Scalia turned to textualism. I like to say in the book that textualism was the metal detector that we use to
Mm.
find the original meaning. All you have to do is look at the actual text. Now, Scalia would elaborate on that later, saying that if the text were vague, you would want to look to history and tradition.
Mhm.
And for example, he would point out that for 200 years, abortion was ruled illegal by the laws in many, many states. But in any case, originalism and textualism were considered revolutionary ideas, heretical against this popular and seductive notion of a living constitution. But by the time Scalia died, no less a figure than Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, an appointee of Barack Obama, proclaimed in effect that because of the way that Scalia changed the ways in which lawyers argue the law, the ways in which judges and justices write their decisions about the law, the way even that lawmakers craft laws. And again, because this touches into every area of American life, Kagan pronounced, quote, "We are all originalists now."
This is such an important topic, and actually, you and I talked off air before this about when Volume 2 comes out. I want to talk about this at great length, and just having watched Scalia's speeches, reading his writings, reading his decisions, and so on. The notion that the Constitution is not made up of, its amendments and so on are not empty bottles to be filled from generation to generation. And that, like you've said, the notion of legislative intent or legislative history, going to a committee report, going to a floor speech, and saying, well, we're going to look at that floor speech from this very partisan congressperson, and we're going to interpret the meaning of the law through that. Well, if that's what the law meant, it should say that in the words of the law itself. And it strikes me that so much of Scalia's push was the notion that there needs to be separation of powers. There needs to be a checks and balances, and that once you start getting loose and free with unelected judges that are just kind of divining what they think is the meaning of the law, therein abuse lies. And he says, we always think we're going to. I remember reading something where he was saying something along the lines of, we think by just interpreting along the lines of the living constitution, we get wider, broader, freer. But the fact of the matter is, who's to say under this type of philosophy that at sometime in the future that thumb screws are actually not cruel and unusual punishment? You could reason for bad things based on sort of a certain relativism in your understanding of what the law says. And so, to some extent, I just so appreciate the fact that he says, I am bound by the law. And the words matter, and if you want to change it, it is not my place, an unelected judge in the judiciary branch, to change the meaning of the law. It is up to the will of the people as represented through the legislature. And I just think therein lies the opening of chaos and misinterpretations and abuses if we don't say we're anchored by the words of the law. So I think you treat this so well. I can only imagine, as you explore from 1986, 87 to the end of his life in all of his jurisprudence, his dissents, and so on, I imagine that's going to be a dominant theme throughout the remainder of Volume 2. Is that fair
For
to say?
sure. And the Supreme Court is really, to use a metaphor from a different discipline, the big show. And that's where
Yeah.
he brought his originalism to its most important influence. Of course, his experience on the Supreme Court was very different from the experience he had on the appellate court, where the judges worked in panels of three, unless the litigants managed to get the case reconsidered by the en banc, which means the entire panel of 11 or 12 judges. But when working in those groups of three judges at a time, let's say Bork, Scalia, and Ginsburg, or Bork, Scalia, and Spotswood Robinson, or one of the other judges of the time, it fostered a certain intimacy, and they could hang out in each other's chambers and kibitz and argue over the law, which Scalia loved to do. As we'll see in the second volume, he had a very different experience in the Supreme Court, where, by and large, there was almost no argument between the justices at any point, not even in the conference where they discussed the cases. In part, this reflected the style of William Rehnquist, who was elevated to chief at the same time that Scalia made it onto the Supreme Court. And Rehnquist's style as chief was very brisk and businesslike. And essentially, Scalia found that he was disappointed in the lack of give and take between the justices, and that it was mainly confined to the written word and to the memos that they circulate. And I can tell you that already, as research for Volume 2, I found some terrific Scalia memos, interactions with his fellow justices, where his personality and his wit and the trenchance of the cogency of his ideas all really shine through.
So your book concludes with his nomination to the Supreme Court in 1986. He's confirmed, as we mentioned at the outset, with a unanimous vote. With questions about stare decisis, the right to privacy, the role of legislative history influencing Supreme Court decisions, How would you describe the tenor of Scalia's confirmation hearings, especially when juxtaposed with today's hearings?
Well, Scalia sailed through his hearings in part because, again, they were paired with another confirmation process that for the elevation of William Rehnquist from Associate Justice to Chief Justice. At that point, Rehnquist had been sitting on the Supreme Court almost 14 years or so, almost 15 years. He was so frequently in solo dissent as the lone conservative, movement conservative on the court. I think 47 solo dissents that his clerks gave him a Lone Ranger doll. And his original confirmation hearing back in 1971 had been marked by acrimonious charges of voter suppression in Arizona and racism. And when he was elevated by President Reagan to the Chief Justiceship, and one of the revelations of Scalia rise to greatness, by the way, is that President Reagan did consider just naming Antonin Scalia to succeed Warren Burger as chief. And in fact, one person I interviewed acquainted Scalia with that fact, someone who had been a lawyer, part of the process for the government, late in Scalia's life, acquainted him with the fact that he had come this close to being nominated by President Reagan as Chief Justice in 1986. Scalia was amazed and it said it was the first time he'd ever heard it. But remind me of the specific question now, Todd.
I guess I was just wondering about when you look at you basically answered it. He sailed
Yes,
through the
okay.
confirmation hearings
So
as opposed to what
let
we
me just
find
do a
today.
pickup if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
So Rehnquist's hearing ended in a vote of confirmation of 65 to 33, which at the time was the highest opposition tally ever sustained by a confirmed nominee. Today, of course, if you limited the opposition to 33 votes, they'd call that a tremendous win for bipartisanship. The Rehnquist hearing, which was called the Rehnquisition due to its ferocity and its nastiness, had a lot in common with both confirmation processes that had preceded it, such as the ones for Haynsworth and Carswell in the Nixon era, who were nominees of President Nixon that were rejected back to back by the Senate, and a lot in common with the very next Supreme Court confirmation process that would ensue after Scalia's 98 to nothing vote, which was the process that yielded the rejection of Robert Bork. And many people consider the Bork hearing the dawn of the modern nastiness of Supreme Court confirmation processes. I would say it really does begin in the Nixon era when Nixon and John Mitchell, who was the subject of one of my previous books, maneuvered to get Abe Fortas to resign from the court due to his own financial improprieties. And the Senate then, in a form of payback for what happened to Fortas, rejected a completely qualified and good nominee in Clement Haynsworth. But the Bork is sort of more for the modern era because by that point you have cable television, you have CNN, you have C-SPAN, and it's kind of a different media environment than in the Nixon era. So Scalia was a witness to the Rehnquisition, and he saw that a new day was and a new and uglier day was dawning in this process.
James, two questions. One is just about the timing of your next book. When will we find volume 2 is released?
Let's just say I've got incentive to finish it quickly because the person who was least pleased by the transformation of this book from its original model of a concise biography of Antonin Scalia into a mammoth 2-volume set is Mrs. Rosen, who had good reasons to resent the 2-year extension on Justice Scalia's lease on the lives of the Rosens. So we'll see.
Well, we're excited to see that, and it's a riveting lead up to the main event, but it's an extraordinary backstory. I want to ask you one last question, James, before we part ways. How has this research? How is your initial understanding of Justice Antonin Scalia, and now your fuller, richer understanding of him? How has it changed you? How have you been impacted by what you've learned?
I'm grateful for the question because I was concerned that we might end the program without me having an opportunity to mention a salient fact, which is that I actually knew Justice Scalia a little bit. When I first came to Washington in 1999 as a young Washington correspondent at the time for the Fox News Channel, one of the first things I did was write to Justice Scalia seeking an interview. This was because 10, 12 years earlier in high school, I had seen Justice Scalia appear on the PBS program, The Constitution, That Delicate Balance, which had a live studio audience in a kind of theater in the round setting on a stage where the moderator was the former president, the nebbishy former president of CBS News, Fred Friendly, and the eminent thinkers who were convened in the theater in the round setting to explore hypothetical scenarios included such eminent figures as Dan Rather, Sandra Day O'Connor, Gerald Ford, Antonin Scalia. And Scalia in those programs immediately struck me as fundamentally different from everyone else. He was casual and more intense at the same time. He spoke in a way a layman could understand, not legalese. And he wasn't afraid to be humorous, even caustic and sarcastic. So when I wrote to him upon arriving in Washington in 1999 seeking an interview, it commenced between us a lengthy and sometimes amusing correspondence that spanned about 2 years' time. And it led to a pair of one-on-one lunches between us, both times, just the two of us, at his favorite place, which was a very modest Italian restaurant called the AV Ristorante Italiano. He'd been going there since his Georgetown days in the 50s. It was located in what was then a fairly sketchy part of Washington in which you wouldn't expect to find a Supreme Court justice. And we drank wine together. He made me eat off of his plate. I said, "Mr. Justice, I couldn't." And he said, "Come on, come on, come on." So now here I am shoveling vegetables off of Justice Scalia's plate into my mouth. And he even gave me a ride back to my office on each occasion in his car. And I was able to confirm through my research, Todd, that both by interviewing classmates of Scalia's who had traveled with him to debate tournaments in the 50s, all the way up through Supreme Court clerks in the 21st century, that being a passenger in a car driven by Antonin Scalia was for them every bit as unnerving an experience as it proved for me. And so he was very generous to a young reporter a long time ago, and I resolved at that time that someday I would write about him. The specific substantive discussions we had will remain off the record, but I do hope to quote from the amusing correspondence in the second volume. And in answer to your question of how my conception of him has changed since then, the answer, I have to invoke words you stated at the outset of our program, that it was a pleasure to study someone in greater and greater depth and only come away with more and more admiration for them. There aren't too many people of whom you'd be able to say that, certainly in public life. Antonin Scalia is one of them.
James Rosen, newsman, author, expert chronicler of the late Justice Antonin Scalia, and with his new release, Scalia, Rise to Greatness, 1936 and 1986. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
I enjoyed it. Thank you, Todd.
So I've been thinking, what does the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia have to do with our faith? Plenty. Let me explain. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights are anchoring documents for our democracy. Hardly serving as merely ornamental scripts, these words were born out of the blood of revolution, the spittle of infighting, and the thought of philosophical masters. Codifying customs and mores and acknowledging the brokenness of humankind, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights gave our government its ingenious structure. 3 branches of government, checks and balances. You remember civics, right? And it also offered the foundation for all future laws. Given the nature of these originating documents, a Supreme Court justice must have a sensible judicial philosophy. That philosophy must respect the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the subsequent federal and state laws that have sprung forth from the democratic lawmaking process. As such, words matter, and prudent judicial interpretation of words matter. To interpret laws to mean something other than what they did when passed and signed risks an unelected judge unilaterally dividing a law of their own choosing that would never have passed nor reflected the will of the people if it were debated as such on the floor of the House or Senate. As such, the textualist, originalist justice like Justice Scalia finds himself, whether he likes it or not, hamstrung by the words that comprise the law. Law cannot be adjusted based on whim and appetite, a new meaning for a new time, or empty bottles to be filled anew with each succeeding generation. In effect, the law is bigger and more enduring than the judge. There are laws that are technically constitutional, passed democratically, and still bad laws. Scalia rightly broods, the judge who always likes the results he reaches is a bad judge, because he is constrained by what the law says. Scalia also jokes, a lot of stuff that's stupid is not unconstitutional. They ought to pass out to all federal judges a stamp, and the stamp says, whack, stupid but constitutional. Whack, stupid but constitutional. In effect, a law is concrete and serves as a criterion. It must comport with and not run afoul of the Constitution or Bill of Rights. And unless this law is changed through a democratic process, vote in the legislature, signed by the executive, deemed constitutional by the judiciary, it is a law of the land. To have a judiciary that performs an end run by interpreting the law in a fashion never intended is to commit legal malpractice. It compromises democratic process by circumventing the delicate balance of powers between the three branches of government. Trifling with measures that would upset the balance of power between these branches is a slippery slope to despotism. And Scalia is blistering in his criticism of this type of judging, calling it interpretive jiggery-pokery or legalistic argle-bargle. Our faith, too, has its roots in scripture and tradition, anchoring laws and abiding principles. To be sure, Christ insisted that the spirit of the law, for example, don't kill is broadened to don't hate, don't commit adultery is broadened to don't lust. But that must not get lost in a hyper-acute, self-serving, low-bar literalism. However, Jesus also reminded that the law as written deserves a proper respect. Till heaven and earth pass away, Christ said, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Words matter. The divine law matters. And we should be careful lest in our own self-serving ways we risk slipping into sin with the theological interpretive jiggery-pokery or legalistic argle-bargle. The Greek physicist Archimedes purportedly once declared, "Give me a place to stand, and I will move the earth." A fixed respect for the law of the nation and the process by which we could change what we reason should be changed, as well as a holy reverence for the foundations of our faith, is indeed a mighty good place to stand. And one last thing. For this week's book, I would heartily recommend James Rosen's Scalia, Rise to Greatness. But also for a more in-depth academic, profoundly intriguing glimpse at Antonin Scalia's judicial philosophy, Ralph Rossum's Antonin Scalia's Jurisprudence, Text and Tradition. An honest exploration of the reasoning behind textualism is an intriguing and worthwhile endeavor. Thank you for listening to the Evangelization and Culture Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to Word on Fire's YouTube channel, leave a review, and share with your friends. And don't forget to get a free copy of Word on Fire's award-winning journal, Evangelization and Culture, at wordonfire.org/journal. Until next time, I'm Todd Warner. Please keep proclaiming Christ to a hungry culture.